The others appeared caught in their own thoughts. Lord Bryn sat his saddle easily, the mist of his even breath forming a light frost on his face guard, yet Egwene could see him calmly marking terrain in his mind, in case he had to fight over it. Swan rode so stiffly that she would be sore long before reaching their destination, but she stared north as though she could already see the lake, and sometimes she nodded to herself or shook her head. She would not have done that unless she was uneasy. Shiriam knew no more of what was to come than the sitters did, yet she appeared even more nervous than Swan, shifting constantly in her saddle and grimacing. Anger shone in her green eyes, too, for some reason. Close behind the banner came the entire hall of the tower in double column, wearing embroidered silks and rich velvets and furs and cloaks with the flame large on the back. Women who seldom wore more ornaments than the great serpent ring were decked today in the finest gems the camp's jewelry caskets could supply. Their warders made a more splendid display simply by wearing their color-shifting cloaks. Parts of the men seemed to vanish as the disquieting cloaks swirled in the stiff breeze. Servants followed, 2 or 3 for every sister, on the best horses that could be found for them. They might have passed for lesser nobility themselves, if a number had not been leading pack animals. Every chest in the camp had been ransacked to outfit them in bright colors. Perhaps because she was one of the sitters without a warder, Delana had brought Halima along on a spirited white mare. The two rode almost knee to knee. Sometimes Delana would lean toward Halima to speak privately, though Halima appeared too excited to listen. Supposedly Halima was Delana's secretary, but everyone believed it a case of charity, or possibly friendship, however unlikely, between the dignified, pale-haired sister and the hot-natured, raven-haired countrywoman. Egwene had seen Halima's hand, and it had the unformed look of a child's just learning her letters. Today she was in garments as fine as any sister's, with gems that easily equaled Delana's, who must have been their source. Whenever a gust opened her velvet cloak, she displayed a shocking amount of bosom, and she always laughed and took her time about gathering it around her again, refusing to admit that she felt the cold any more than the sisters did. For once, Egwene was glad of all the gifts of clothing she had been given, allowing her to surpass the sitters. Her green and blue silk was slashed with white and worked with seed pearls. Pearls even decorated the backs of her gloves. At the last minute, a cloak lined with ermine had been provided by Romanda, and a necklace and earrings of emeralds and white opals by Lelaine. The moonstones in her hair came from Janya. The Amerlin had to be resplendent today. Even Swan appeared ready for a ball, in blue velvets and cream lace, with a wide band of pearls at her throat and more laced through her hair. Romanda and Lelaine led the sitters, riding so closely behind the soldier bearing the banner that he glanced over his shoulder nervously and sometimes edged his horse nearer the riders ahead of him. Egwene managed not to look back more than once or twice, yet she could feel their eyes pressing between her shoulder blades. Each thought her tied in a neat bundle, but each had to be wondering whose cords had done the binding. Oh, light, this could not go wrong. Not now. Other than the column, little moved in all that snow-covered landscape. A broad-winged hawk wheeled overhead against the cold blue sky for a time before winging eastward. Twice Egwene saw black-tailed foxes trotting in the distance, still in their summer fur. And once a large deer with tall, forked antlers ghosted away and vanished amid the trees. A hare, starting up right under Bella's hooves and bounding off, made the shaggy mare toss her head, and Swan yelped and grabbed at the reins as if she expected Bella to bolt. Of course, Bella only gave a reproachful snort and plodded onward. Egwene's tall roan gelding shied more, and the hare had not gone near him. Swan began grumbling under her breath after the hare scampered away, and it took quite some time before she eased Bella's reins. Being on a horse always made her grumpy. She traveled in one of the wagons whenever possible, but she was seldom this bad. There was no need to look further than Lord Bryn, or her fierce glances at him, to know why. If he noticed Swan's looks, he gave no sign. The only one not in fine array, he looked as he always did, plain and slightly battered, a rock that had weathered storms and would outlast more to come. For some reason, Egwene was glad he had resisted their efforts to dress him in finer garb. They truly did need to make an impression, yet she thought he made an excellent one as he was. "It's a fine morning to be in the saddle," Shiriam said after a time. "Nothing like a good ride in the snow to clear the head." Her voice was not low, and she cut her eyes at the still muttering Swan with a tiny smile. Swan did not say anything. She hardly could do that in front of so many eyes, but she did give Shiriam a hard look that promised sharp words for later. The fire-haired woman twisted away abruptly with very close to a wince. Wing, her dappled gray mare, pranced a few steps, and Shiriam settled her down with almost too firm a hand. She had shown little gratitude to the woman who had named her mistress of novices, and like most in that position, she found reasons to blame Swan. It was the only flaw Egwene had found in her since the swearing. Well, she had protested that as keeper, she should not have to take orders from Swan the way the others who had sworn did, but Egwene had seen right away where that would lead. This was not the first time Shiriam had tried to plant a barb. Swan insisted on handling Shiriam herself, and her pride was too fragile for Egwene to deny the request unless matters got out of hand. Egwene wished there was some way to make more speed. Swan went back to her grumbling, and Shiriam was obviously thinking of something else to say that would not quite bring a rebuke. All that muttering and cutting of eyes began to find their way under Egwene's skin. After a while, even Bryn's level-headed poise began to wear. She found herself thinking of things she might say that would shake his aplomb. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, she did not believe anything could. But if she had to wait much longer, she thought she might burst from sheer impatience. The sun climbed toward midday, the painfully slow miles passed behind, and at last one of the riders ahead turned and raised his hand. With a hasty apology to Egwene, Bryn galloped forward. It was really more of a lumber through the snow for his sturdy bay gelding traveler, but he caught up to the outriders, exchanged a few words, then sent them on through the trees and waited for Egwene and the others to reach him. As he fell in beside her once more, Romanda and Lilane joined them. The two sitters barely acknowledged Egwene's presence, fixing Bryn with the cool serenity that had shaken so many men facing Aes Sedai. Except that now and then, each glanced sideways at the other in a considering way. They hardly seemed to realize what they were doing. Egwene hoped they were half as nervous as she. She would be satisfied with that. Coolly serene stares washed over Bryn like rain over that rock. He made slight bows to the sitters, but he spoke to Egwene. "They've already arrived, Mother." That had been expected. "They brought almost as many men as we did, but they're all on the north side of the lake. I've put scouts out to make sure nobody tries circling around, but in truth I don't expect it." "Let us hope you are right," Romanda told him sharply. And Lilane added in a much colder tone, "Your judgment has not been all it should be of late, Lord Bryn." A frigid, cutting tone. "As you say, Aes Sedai." He made another slight bow without really turning from Egwene. Like Swan, he was tied to her openly now, at least so far as the hall was concerned. If only they did not know how tightly. If only she could be sure how tightly. "One thing more, Mother," he went on. "Talmanis is there at the lake, too. There are about 100 of the band on the east side. Not enough to cause trouble even if he wanted to, and small chance he would, I think." Egwene merely nodded. Not enough to cause trouble? Talmanis alone might be enough. She tasted bile. It could not go wrong now. "Talmanis!" Lilane exclaimed, serenity shattering. She must have been as much on edge as Egwene. "How did he find out? If you've included Dragonsworn in your scheming, Lord Bryn, you truly will learn what going too far means." Right on top of her, Romanda growled, "This is disgraceful. You say you've only learned of his presence now? If that's so, your reputation is puffed up like a boil." Aes Sedai calm was a thin layer for some today, it seemed. They continued in that vein, but Bryn rode on, only murmuring the occasional, "As you say, Aes Sedai," when he had to say something. He had received worse in Egwene's hearing this morning and reacted no more. It was Swan who finally snorted, and then blushed crimson when the sitters looked at her in surprise. Egwene almost shook her head. Swan was very definitely in love, and she very definitely needed talking to. For some reason, Bryn smiled, but that might just have been because he was no longer the object of the sitters' attention. Trees gave way to another open space, larger than most, and there was no more time for frivolous thoughts. Aside from a wide rim of tall brown reeds and cattails poking through the snow, nothing named this a lake. It could have been a big meadow, flat and very roughly oval in shape. Some distance from the tree line on the frozen lake stood a large blue canopy on tall poles, with a small crowd of people milling about it and dozens of horses held by servants behind. The breeze ruffled the bright flags and banners and carried muffled shouts that could only have been orders. More servants darted about hastily. Apparently, they had not been there long enough to finish their preparations. Perhaps a mile away the trees began again and the feeble sunlight glinted off metal there. Quite a lot of metal, stretching the length of the far shore. To the east, almost as close as the pavilion, the 100 men of the band made no effort at concealment, standing beside their mounts just short of where the cattails began. A few of them pointed when the flag of Tar Valon appeared. The people at the pavilion stopped to look. Egwene did not pause before riding out onto the snow-covered ice. She did imagine herself a rosebud opening to the sun, though, that old novice exercise. She did not actually embrace Saidar, but the calm that came was very welcome. Swan and Shiriam followed, and the sitters with their warders, and the servants. Lord Bryn and the bannerman were the only 2 soldiers who went. Shouts rising behind her told of Uno putting his armored horsemen into position along the shoreline. The more lightly armored men were arrayed to either side, those not off guarding against treachery. One reason the lake had been chosen was that the ice was thick enough to hold a fair number of horses, but not hundreds, much less thousands. That cut down on the chance of chicanery. Of course, a pavilion beyond bowshot was not beyond the range of the one power, not if it could be seen. Except that the worst man in the world knew himself safe from that unless he threatened a sister. Egwene exhaled sharply and began acquiring calm all over again. A proper greeting for the Amerlin seat should have had servants rushing forward with warm drinks and cloths wrapped around hot bricks, and the lords and ladies themselves to take reins and offer a kiss in token of Abram. Any visitor of rank at all would have had the servants, but no one stirred from the pavilion. Bryn himself dismounted and came to hold Daishar's bridle, and the same lanky young man who had come with fresh charcoal the day before ran to hold Egwene's stirrup. His nose still dripped, but in a red velvet coat only a little too large for him and a bright blue cloak, he outshone any of the nobles who stood staring from under the canopy. They appeared to be in stout woolens for the most part, with not much embroidery and very little silk or lace. Likely they had to scramble to find suitable clothes once the snows began, and them already on the march. Though the simple truth was that the young man might have outshone a tinker. Carpets had been laid to floor the pavilion, and braziers lit, though the breeze carried away heat and smoke alike. Chairs stood in 2 facing lines for the delegations, 8 in each. They had not expected so many sisters. Some of the waiting nobles exchanged looks of consternation, and a number of their servants actually wrung their hands, wondering what to do. They need not have. The chairs were a mismatched miscellany, but they were all alike in size, and none was noticeably more worn or battered than another. None had noticeably more or less gilded carving. The lanky young man and a number of others trotted in, and under the frowns of the nobles, without so much as a by your leave, carried those meant for Aes Sedai out into the snow, then rushed to help with unloading the horses, still no one spoke of him. Quickly, seats were set up sufficient for the entire hall, and Egwene. Only simple benches, though polished till they gleamed, but each stood on a wide box covered with cloth in the color of the sitter's aja, in a long row as wide as the canopy. The box placed in front for Egwene's bench was striped like her stole. There had been a great flurry of activity in the night, beginning with finding beeswax for polish and good cloth of the right colors. When Egwene and the sitters took their places, they sat a foot higher than anyone else. She had had her doubts about that, but the lack of any word of welcome had settled those. The meanest farmer would have offered a cup and a kiss to a vagabond on a feast of Abram. They were not supplicants, and they were not equals. They were Aes Sedai. Elders stood behind their Aes Sedai, and Swan and Shiriam flanked Egwene. The sisters ostentatiously flung back cloaks and tucked gloves away to emphasize that the cold did not touch them, a sharp contrast to the nobles clutching their own cloaks close. Outside, the flame of Tar Valon lifted in the stiffening breeze. Only Halima, lounging beside Delana's chair on the edge of the gray-covered box, at all spoiled the grand image, and her big green eyes stared at the Andorans and the Murandians so challengingly that she did not spoil it much. There were a few stares when Egwene took the seat in front, but only a few. No one really looked surprised. I suppose they've heard all about the girl Amerlin, she thought dryly. Well, there had been queens younger, including Queens of Andor and Murandi. Calmly she nodded, and Shiriam gestured to the line of chairs. No matter who had arrived first or provided the pavilion, there was no doubt who had called this meeting, who was in charge. Her action was not well received, of course. There was a moment of silent hesitation while the nobles cast their minds about for some way to regain an equal footing, and no few grimaces as they realized it could not be done. Grim-faced, 8 of them sat down, 4 men and 4 women, with much angry gathering of cloaks and adjusting of skirts. Those of lesser rank stood behind the chairs, and clearly there was little love lost between Andoran and Murandian. For that matter, the Murandians, men and women alike, muttered and jostled one another for precedence as fiercely as they did their allies from the north. The Aes Sedai received a good many dark looks as well, and a few folk spared scowls for Bryn, who stood off to one side with his helmet under his arm. He was well known on both sides of the border, and respected even by most of those who would have liked to see him dead. At least that had been the case before he turned up leading the Aes Sedai's army. He ignored their acid glares as he had the sitters' acid tongues. Another man did not join with either party. A pale man, less than a hand taller than Egwene, in a dark coat and breastplate. He wore the front of his head shaved, and there was a long red scarf tied around his left arm. His deep gray cloak had a large red hand worked on the breast. Talmanis stood opposite Bryn, leaning against one of the pavilion's poles with an arrogant casualness, and watched without revealing a hint of his thoughts. Egwene wished she knew what he was doing there. She wished she knew what he had said before she arrived. In any case, she had to speak with him, if it could be managed without 100 ears listening. A lean, withered man in a red cloak sitting in the middle of the row of chairs leaned forward and opened his mouth, but Shiriam forestalled him in a clear, carrying voice. "Mother, may I present to you of Andor, Arathel Renshar, High Seat of House Renshar, Pelivar Coelan, High Seat of House Coelan, Aemlyn Carand, High Seat of House Carand, and her husband, Kulhan Carand." They acknowledged their names sourly with bare nods and no more. Pelivar was the lean man. He was losing his dark hair from the front. Shiriam went on without pause. It was a good thing Bryn had been able to supply the names of those who had been chosen to speak. "May I present of Murandi, Donal do Morni a Lord Dane, Shan do Mihon a Makansa, Peter do Firna a Con, Sigan do Avharin a Rus." The Murandians seemed to feel the lack of titles even more than the Andorans. Donal, wearing more lace than most of the women, twisted his curled mustaches fiercely, and Piter appeared to be trying to yank his loose. Segan pursed full lips and her dark eyes caught fire, while Sean, a stocky, graying woman, snorted quite loudly. Shiriam took no notice. "You are beneath the eyes of the Watcher of the Seals. You are before the flame of Tarvalon. You may present your supplications to the Amerlin seat." Well, they did not like that. Not in the least. Egwene had thought them sour before, but now they looked stuffed full of green persimmons. Perhaps they had believed they could pretend she was not the Amerlin at all. They would learn. Of course, first she had to teach the hall. "There are ancient ties between Andor and the White Tower," she said loudly and firmly. "Sisters have always expected welcome in Andor or Murandy. Why then do you bring an army against Aes Sedai? You meddle where thrones and nations fear to step. Thrones have fallen, meddling in the affairs of Aes Sedai." That sounded suitably threatening, whether or not Mirella and the others had managed to prepare her way. With luck, they were well on their way back to the camp, with no one the wiser, unless one of these nobles spoke the wrong name. That would lose her an advantage against the hall, but alongside everything else, it was a straw beside a hayloft. Pelivar exchanged looks with the woman seated beside him, and she stood. Creases in her face could not disguise the fact that Arathel had been a beautiful, fine-boned woman when young. Now gray threaded thickly through her hair, and her gaze struck as hard as any warder's. Her red-gloved hands gripped the edges of her cloak at her sides, but plainly not in worry. Mouth compressed to a thin line, she scanned the line of sitters, and only then spoke. Past Egwene, to the sisters behind her. Gritting her teeth, Egwene put on an attentive expression. "We are here precisely because we do not want to become entangled in the White Tower's affairs." Arathel's voice held tones of authority, unsurprising in the high seat of a powerful house. There was no hint of the diffidence that might have been expected, even from a powerful high seat facing so many sisters, not to mention the Amerlin seat. "If all we've heard is true, then at best allowing you to pass through Andor unhindered may seem like giving aid or even alliance in the eyes of the White Tower. Failure to oppose you might mean learning what the grape learns in the winepress." Several of the Murandians turned their scowls on her. No one in Murandy had tried to hinder the sisters' passage. Very likely no one had considered the possibilities beyond the day they passed on to another's lands. Arathel continued as if she had not noticed, but Egwene doubted that. "At worst, we have heard reports of Aes Sedai making their way into Andor in secret, and Tower guards. Rumors might be a better word, but they come from many places. None of us would like to see a battle between Aes Sedai in Andor." "The light preserve and protect us," Donal burst out, red-faced. Piter nodded encouragement, sliding to the edge of his seat, and Sean looked ready to jump in herself. "No one wants to see it here either," Donal spat. "Not between Aes Sedai. For sure we've heard what happened out east, and those sisters—" Egwene breathed a little more easily when Arathel stepped on him firmly. "If you please, Lord Donal, you will have your turn to speak." She turned back to Egwene, to the sitters once more, really, without waiting on his reply, leaving him spluttering and the other 3 Murandians glowering. She herself looked quite undisturbed, simply a woman laying out the facts. Laying them out, and meaning that they should be seen as she saw them. "As I was saying, that is the worst we fear, if the tales are true, and also if they are not. Aes Sedai may be gathering secretly in Andor with Tower guards. Aes Sedai with an army ready to enter Andor. Often enough the White Tower has seemed to aim at one target only for the rest of us to learn later it was aiming at another all along. I can hardly imagine even the White Tower going this far, but if ever there was a target you might twist yourselves into a knot for, it's the Black Tower." Arathel shivered slightly, and Egwene did not think it was the cold. A battle between Aes Sedai might ruin the land for miles around. That battle might ruin half of Andor. Pelivar sprang to his feet. "The plain of it is, you must go another way." His voice was surprisingly high, but no less firm than Arathel's. "If I must die to defend my lands and my people, then better here than where my lands and people die too." He subsided at Arathel's soothing gesture, sinking back into his chair. Hard-eyed, he did not look mollified. Aemlyn, a plump woman wrapped in dark wool, nodded agreement with him, as did her square-faced husband. Donal stared at Pelivar as though he had never had this thought either, and he was not the only one. Some of the standing Murandians began to argue out loud until others quieted them, sometimes with a shaken fist. Whatever had possessed these people to join forces with the Andorans? Egwene drew breath. A rosebud opening to the sun. They had not acknowledged her as the Amyrlin seat. Arathel had come as close to ignoring her as was possible without pushing her aside, yet they had given her everything else she could have wished for. Calm. Now was when Lelaine and Romanda would be expecting her to name one of them to handle the negotiations. She hoped their stomachs were tied in knots with wondering which of them it would be. There would be no negotiations. There could be none. "Elida," she said levelly, eyeing Arathel and the seated nobles in turn, "is a usurper who has violated what lies at the very heart of the White Tower. I am the Amyrlin seat." She was surprised at how stately she managed to sound, how cool, but not as surprised as she once would have been. The light helper, she was the Amyrlin seat. "We go to Tar Valon to remove Elida and try her, but that is the White Tower's business, and none of yours except to know the truth. This so-called Black Tower also is our business. Men who can channel have always been the White Tower's affair. We will deal with them as we choose when the time is ripe, but I assure you that time is not now. More important matters must take precedence." She heard movements among the sitters behind her, an actual shifting on benches, and the crisp swishing of divided skirts being adjusted. At least some must be severely agitated. Well, several had suggested that the Black Tower might be dealt with in passing. Not one believed there could be more than a dozen or so men there at most, no matter what they heard. After all, it simply was not possible that hundreds of men would want to channel. Then again, it might have been the realization that Egwene was not going to name either Romanda or Lelaine. Arathel frowned, perhaps catching a hint of something in the air. Pelivar moved, on the point of rising again, and Donal drew himself up querulously. There was nothing for it but to press on. There never had been. "I understand your concerns," she continued in the same formal tone, "and I will address them. What was that strange call to arms the band used? Yes, it was time to toss the dice. I give you this assurance as the Amyrlin seat. For 1 month we will stay here, resting, and then we will leave Murandy, but we will not cross the border into Andor. Murandy will be troubled by us no more after that, and Andor will not be troubled at all. I'm certain," she added, "the Murandian lords and ladies here will be happy to supply our wants in exchange for good silver. We will pay fair prices." There was no point mollifying the Andorans if it meant Murandians raiding the horses and supply trains. The Murandians, looking around uneasily, appeared decidedly torn in any case. There was coin to be made, and a great deal of it supplying an army so large. But on the other hand, who could haggle successfully with whatever an army so large offered? Donal actually seemed ready to sick up, while Shan seemed to be doing sums in her head. Mutters rose among the onlookers, more than mutters, nearly loud enough for Egwene. She wanted to look over her shoulder. The silence from the sitters was deafening. Swan was staring straight ahead and gripping her skirts as if to keep herself looking forward by main force. At least she had known what was coming. Shiriam, who had not, eyed the Andorans and Murandians regally, calmly, as though she had expected every word. Egwene needed to make them forget the girl they saw before them, and hear a woman with the reins of power firmly in hand. If they were not in her hands now, they would be. She firmed her voice. "Mark me well. I have made my decision. It is for you to accept it, or face what surely will come from your failure." As she fell silent, the wind gusted to a brief howl, rattling the canopy, tugging at garments. Egwene straightened her hair calmly. Some of the watching nobles shivered and twitched their cloaks around them, and she hoped their shivers came from more than the weather. Arathel exchanged looks with Pelavar and Aemlyn, and all three studied the sitters before slowly nodding. They believed she was merely mouthing words the sitters had put on her tongue. Even so, Egwene very nearly sighed with relief. "It will be as you say," the hard-eyed noblewoman said. Again to the sitters. "We do not doubt the word of Aes Sedai, of course, but you will understand if we also remain. Sometimes what you hear isn't what you think you heard. Not that that's the case here, I'm sure, but we will stay while you do." Donal truly looked ready to empty himself. Very likely his lands lay nearby. Andoran armies in Murandy had seldom been known to pay for anything. Egwene stood, and she could hear the rustle of the sitters rising behind her. "It is agreed, then. We must all depart soon, if we are to return to our own beds before dark, but we should spare a few moments. Getting to know one another a little better now might avoid misunderstandings later. And talk might give her a chance to reach Talmanis. Oh, one other thing you should all be aware of. The novice book is now open to any woman, whatever her age, if she tests true." Arathel blinked. Swan did not, yet Egwene thought she heard a faint grunt. This was not part of what they had discussed, but there would never be a better time. "Come, I'm sure you would all like to speak with the sitters. Let formality go." Without waiting for Shiriam to offer a hand, she stepped down. She almost felt like laughing. Last night she had been afraid she might never reach her goal, but she was halfway there, almost halfway, and it had not been nearly as difficult as she had feared. Of course, the other half remained. Chapter 18. A Peculiar Calling. For a moment after Egwene descended, no one else moved, and then the Andorans and Murandians headed for the sitters, almost as one. Apparently a girl Amerlin, a girl puppet and figurehead, held no interest, not with ageless faces in front of them that at least said they actually were speaking to Aes Sedai. 2 or 3 lords and ladies clustered around each sitter, some thrusting their chins demandingly, others diffidently bending their necks, yet every one insistent on being heard. The sharp breeze whisked away the mist of their breath and fluttered cloaks forgotten in the importance of asking their questions. Shiriam was buttonholed too, by red-faced Lord Donal, who blustered and jerked bows by turns. Egwene pulled Shiriam away from the narrow-eyed man. "Find out discreetly all you can about these sisters and tower guards in Andor," she whispered hastily. As soon as she released the woman, Donal reclaimed her. Shiriam actually looked put upon, but her frown disappeared quickly. Donal blinked uneasily as she began questioning him. Lavanda and Lelaine gazed at Egwene through the crowd with faces carved from ice, but each had acquired a pair of nobles who wanted something. Reassurance that there was no hidden trick in Egwene's words, perhaps. How they would hate doing that. But dodge and duck as they would, and they would, there was no way to really avoid that reassurance without repudiating her on the spot. Even those two would not go that far. Not here. Not publicly. Swan slipped close to Egwene, features set in meekness, except that her eyes darted, maybe looking for Ramonda or Lelaine coming to seize them where they stood, and forget law, custom, propriety, and who was watching. "Shine Chunla," she all but hissed in a whisper. Egwene nodded, but her eyes searched for Talmanis. Most of the men and some of the women were tall enough to hide him. With everyone shifting about, she went up on her toes. Where had he gone to? Seagun planted herself in front of her, fists on her hips, eyeing Swan doubtfully. Egwene let her heels down hurriedly. The Amerlin could not bob about like a girl at a dance looking for a rosebud unfolding, calm, serenity. Drat all men. A slender woman with long, dark hair, Seagun seemed to have been born petulant, her full fixed and pout. Her dress was good blue wool, made for warmth, but it had far too much vivid green embroidery across the brim, and her gloves were bright enough for a tinker. She looked Egwene up and down, pursing her lips, with as much incredulity on her face as she had given Swan. "What you said about the novice book," she said abruptly. "Were you meaning any woman of any age at all? Any can become Aes Sedai, then?" A question close to Egwene's heart, and an answer she dearly wanted to give, along with a box on the ear for the doubt. But just then a small gap in the flow of people showed her Talmanis near the back of the pavilion, talking with Pelavar. They stood stiffly, mastiffs not quite ready to show teeth, yet they were keeping a watch to make sure no one came close enough to overhear what they had to say. "Any woman of any age at all, daughter," she agreed. "Pelavar?" "Thank you," Seagun said, and haltingly added, "Mother." She sketched a curtsy, the barest hint of one, before hurrying off. Egwene stared after her. Well, it was a beginning. Swan snorted. "I don't mind sailing the fingers of the dragon in the dark if I must," she muttered half under her breath. "We discussed that. And anyway, there doesn't seem to be a gull's last dinner for choice. But you have to set a fire on deck just to make things interesting. Netting lionfish isn't enough for you. You have to stuff a prickleback down your dress, too. You aren't content trying to wade a school of silver pike." Egwene broke in. "Swan, I think I should tell Lord Bryn you're head over heels in love with him. It's only fair that he know, don't you agree?" Swan's blue eyes bulged, and her mouth worked, but all that came out was a sort of gobbling. Egwene patted her shoulder. "Your Aes Sedai, Swan. Try to maintain at least a little dignity, and try to find out about those sisters in Andor." The crowd parted again. She saw Talmanis in a different place, but still on the edge of the pavilion, and alone now. Trying not to hurry, she walked in his direction, leaving Swan still gobbling. A pretty black-haired serving man, whose bulky woolen breeches could not quite hide neatly turned calves, offered Swan a steaming silver cup from a tray. Other servants were moving about with other silver trays. Refreshment was being offered, if a bit late. It was much too late for the kiss of peace. She did not hear what Swan said as she snatched a cup, but from the way the fellow jerked and started bobbing bows, he had received sharp shards of her temper at the least. Egwene sighed. Talmanis stood with arms folded, observing the goings-on with an amused smile that did not reach his eyes. He seemed poised to explode into motion, but his eyes were tired. At her approach, he made a respectful leg, but there was a wry touch to his voice when he said, "You changed a border today." He gathered his cloak against the icy breeze. "It has always been fluid between Andor and Murundi, no matter what maps say. But Andor has never come south in such numbers before. Except for the Aiel War and the White Cloak War, anyway, but they were only passing through then. Once they have been here a month, new maps will show a new line. Look at the Murandians scramble, fawning over Pelavar and his companions as much as they do the sisters. They are hoping to make new friends for the new day." To Egwene, trying to conceal her careful watch on those who might be watching her, it seemed that all of the nobles, Murandian and Andoran, were intent on the sitters, crowding around them. In any case, she had slightly more important matters in mind than borders, to her, if not to the nobles. Except for brief moments, none of the sitters were visible beyond the tops of their heads. Only Halima and Swan seemed to notice her, and a babble like that of a flock of excited geese filled the air. She lowered her voice and chose her words carefully. "Friends are always important, Talmanis. You've been a good friend to Matt, and I think to me. I hope that hasn't changed. I hope you've not told anyone what you shouldn't. Light, she was anxious, or she would not have been so direct. Next, she would come right out and ask what he and Pelavar had been talking about. Luckily, he did not laugh at her for a blunt-tongued village woman, though he might have been thinking it. He studied her seriously before speaking. In a soft voice, he also knew caution. Not all men gossip. Tell me, when you sent Matt south, did you know what you would do here today? How could I know that 2 months ago? No, Aes Sedai aren't omniscient, Talmanis. She had hoped for something that would put her in the place she was, had planned for it, but she had not known, not back then. She also hoped he did not gossip. Some men did not. Romanda started toward her with a firm stride and a frozen face, but Arathel intercepted her, catching the yellow sitter's arm and refusing to be put off, despite Romanda's astonishment. "Will you at least tell me where Matt is?" Talmanis asked. "On his way to Caemlyn with the daughter heir? Why are you surprised? A serving woman will speak to a soldier when fetching water from the same stream, even when he is a horrible dragon sworn," he added dryly. Light. Men really were inconvenient at times. The best of them found ways to say exactly the wrong thing at the wrong moment, to ask the wrong question, not to mention inveigling serving women into prattle. So much easier if she could just lie, but he had given her plenty of room within the oaths. Half the truth would suffice and keep him from herring off to Ebu Dar, maybe less than half. Over in the far corner of the pavilion, Swan stood conversing with a tall young redhead with curled mustaches, who was eyeing her as dubiously as Segan had. Nobles usually knew the look of Aes Sedai, but he held only a part of Swan's attention. Her gaze constantly flickered toward Egwene. It seemed to shout, loud as conscience, easier, expedient, what it was to be Aes Sedai. She had not known about today, only hoped. Egwene expelled an irritated breath. Burn the woman. "He was in Ebu Dar, the last I heard," she muttered. "But he must be hurrying north as fast as he can by now. He still thinks he has to save me, Talmanis, and Matrim Cawthon wouldn't miss the chance to be on the spot so he can say I told you so." Talmanis did not look at all surprised. "I thought it might be so," he sighed. "I have felt something for weeks now. Others in the band have too. Not urgent, but always there. As if he needed me. As if I should look south, anyway. It can be peculiar, following a Taviran." "I suppose it can," she agreed, hoping none of her incredulity showed. It was strange enough to think of Matt the Wastrel as leader of the Band of the Red Hand, much less as Taviran. But surely a Taviran had to be present, nearby at least, to have any effect. "Matt was wrong about you needing rescue. You never had any intention of coming to me for help, did you?" He still spoke softly, but she looked around hurriedly anyway. Swan was still watching them, and so was Halima. Piter stood much too close to her, puffing and preening and stroking his mustaches. From the way he stared down her dress, he had not mistaken her for a sister, that was certain. But she was giving him only half her mind, darting sidelong glances in Egwene's direction while she smiled up at him warmly. Everyone else appeared occupied, and no one stood close enough to hear. "The Amerlin seat could hardly go running for sanctuary, now could she? But there have been times it's been a comfort knowing you were there," she admitted, reluctantly. The Amerlin seat was hardly supposed to need a bolt hole, but it could do no harm so long as none of the sitters knew. "You have been a friend, Talmanis. I hope that continues. I truly do." "You have been more open with me than I expected," he said slowly. "So I will tell you something." His face did not change. To any watcher, he must have seemed as casual as before, but his voice dropped to a whisper. "I have had approaches from King Roedran about the band. It seems he has hopes of being Murandy's first real king. He wants to hire us. I would not have considered it normally, but there is never enough coin, and with this feel of Matt needing us, it might be better if we remain in Murandy. Clear as good glass, you are where you want to be and have everything in hand." He fell silent as a young serving woman curtsied to offer mulled wine. She wore finely embroidered green wool and a cloak plush with spotted rabbit. Other servants from the camp were helping out now as well, no doubt for something to do besides stand and shiver. The young woman's round face was decidedly pinched from the cold. Talmanas waved her off and pulled his cloak back around him, but Egwene took a silver cup to gain a moment for thought. Truly, there was little need for the band any longer. Despite all the muttering, the sisters took their presence as a matter of course now, dragon-sworn or not. They no longer feared an attack, and there had been no real need to use the band's presence to prod them into moving since leaving Salidar. The only true purpose Shen and Kalhar served now was to draw recruits into Bryn's army, men who thought 2 armies meant a battle and wanted to be on the side with the greatest numbers. She had no need of them, but Talmanas had acted as a friend, and she was Amyrlin. Sometimes friendship and responsibility pushed in the same direction. As the serving woman moved off, Egwene laid a hand on Talmanas's arm. "You must not do that. Even the band can't conquer all of Murundi by itself, and every hand will be against you. You know very well the one thing that makes Murandians stand together as foreigners on their soil. Follow us to Tar Valon, Talmanas. Mat will come there, I have no doubt of that." Mat would not really believe she was the Amyrlin until he saw her wearing the stole in the White Tower. "Roedran is no fool," he said placidly. "All he wants us to do is sit and wait. A foreign army, without Aes Sedai, and nobody knowing what it is up to. He should not have much trouble uniting the nobles against us. Then, so he says, we quietly slip across the border. He thinks he can hold on to them afterward." She could not stop a touch of heat entering her voice. "And what is to stop him betraying you? If the threat goes away without a fight, his dream of a united Murundi might too." The fool man seemed amused. "I'm not a fool either. Roedran cannot be ready before spring. This lot would never have stirred from their manners if the Andorans had not come south, and they were on the march before the snows began. Before then, Mat will find us. If he is coming north, he must hear of us. Roedran will have to be satisfied with whatever he has managed by then. So if Mat does intend to go to Tar Valon, I may see you there yet." Egwene made a vexed sound. It was a remarkable plan, the sort of thing Swan might devise, and hardly a scheme she thought Roedran Almaric do Araloa a Naloi could carry off. The fellow was said to be so dissolute he made Mat look wholesome. But then it was hardly a scheme she would have believed Roedran could think up. The only certainty was that Talmanas had made up his mind. "I want your word, Talmanas, that you won't let Roedran pull you into a war." Responsibility. The narrow stole around her neck seemed to weigh 10 times more than her cloak. "If he moves sooner than you think, you will leave whether or not Mat has joined you." "I wish I could promise, but it is not possible," he protested. "I expect the first raid against my foragers 3 days at most after I start moving away from Lord Bryn's army. Every lordling and farmer will think he can pick up a few horses in the night, give me a pinprick, and run off to hide." "I'm not talking about defending yourself, and you know it," she said firmly. "Your word, Talmanas, or I will not allow your agreement with Roedran." The only way to stop it was to betray it, but she would not leave a war in her wake, a war she had started by bringing Talmanas here. Staring at her as if for the first time, he finally bent his head. Strangely, that seemed more formal than his bow had. "It will be as you say, Mother. Tell me, are you sure you are not ta'veren too?" "I am the Amyrlin seat," she replied. "That is quite enough for anyone." She touched his arm again. "The light shine on you, Talmanas." His smile nearly touched his eyes this time. Inevitably, despite their whispers, their talk had been noticed, maybe because of their whispers. The girl who claimed to be Amyrlin, a rebel against the White Tower, in conversation with the leader of 10,000 dragonsworn. Had she made Talmanas' scheme with Roedran harder or easier? Was war in Murundi less likely or more? Swan and her bloody law of unintended consequences. 50 gazes followed her, then darted away as she moved through the crowd, warming her fingers on her cup. Well, most darted away. The sitters' faces were all ageless Aes Sedai serenity, But Lelaine might have been a brown-eyed crow watching a fish struggle in the shallows, while Romanda's slightly darker eyes could have drilled holes through iron. Trying to keep a watch on the sun outside, she made a slow circuit through the pavilion. The nobles were still importuning sitters, but they moved from one to another as if seeking better answers, and she began to notice small things. Donal paused on his way from Janya to Moria, bowing low to Aemlyn, who acknowledged him with a gracious nod. Sean, turning away from Takima, curtsied deeply to Pelivar and received a slight bow in return. There were others, always a Murandian deferring to an Andoran, who responded just as formally. The Andorans tried to ignore Bryn except for the odd scowl, but any number of Murandians sought him out, one by one and well away from everyone else, and from the directions their eyes went, it was plain they were discussing Pelivar, or Arathel, or Aemlyn. Perhaps Talmanas had been right. She received bows and curtsies too, though none so deep as those given Arathel and Pelivar and Aemlyn, much less the sitters. Half a dozen women told her how thankful they were that matters had been resolved peacefully, and almost as many made non-committal noises or shrugged uneasily and expressed the same sentiment, as though they were uncertain it all would end peacefully. Her assurances that it would were met with a fervent, "The light send it so," or a resigned, "It wills." 4 called her mother, one without hesitating first. 3 others said that she was quite lovely, that she had beautiful eyes, and that she had a graceful carriage, in that order. Suitable compliments perhaps for Egwene's age, but not her station. At least she found one unalloyed pleasure. Segan was not alone in being intrigued by her announcement concerning the novice book. Plainly that was why most of the women spoke to her in the first place. After all, the other sisters might be in rebellion against the tower, but she claimed to be the Amerlin seat. Their interest had to be strong to overcome that, though no one wanted to let it show. Arathel made the inquiry with a frown that put more creases in her cheeks. Aemlyn shook her glowing head at the answer. Blocky Shan asked, followed by a sharp-faced Andoran lady named Nagara, then a pretty big-eyed Murandian called Jennet, and others. None wanted to know for herself. Several made that clear quickly, especially the younger women, but before long every single noblewoman there had asked, and several servants as well, under cover of offering more spiced wine. One, a wiry woman named Nildra, had come from the Aes Sedai camp. Egwene felt quite pleased with the seed she had planted there. She was not so pleased with the men. A few spoke to her, but only when they came face to face and seemed to have no other choice. A murmured word about the weather, either praising the end of the drought or deploring the sudden snows. A muttered hope that the bandit problem would end soon, perhaps with a significant look toward Talmanas, and they slipped away like greased pigs. A bear of an Andoran by the name of Makaran tripped over his own boots to avoid her. In a way, it was hardly surprising. The women had the justification, if only to themselves, of the novice book, but the men had only the thought that being seen conversing with her might tar them with the same brush. It was really quite discouraging. She did not care what the men thought about novices, but she very much wanted to know if they were as fearful as the women that this would come to blows in the end. Fears like that could fulfill themselves very easily. At last she decided there was only one way to find out. Pelivar turned from taking a fresh cup of wine from a tray and started back with a muffled oath to keep from bumping into her. Had she stood any closer, she would have had to stand on his boots. Hot wine splashed over his gloved hand and ran down under his coat sleeve, producing a curse not so muted. Tall enough to loom over her, he made a good job of it. His scowl belonged on a man wanting to send an annoying young woman briskly out of his way, or on a man who had nearly stepped on a red adder. She held herself erect and focused on an image of him as a small boy up to no good. That always helped. Most men seemed to feel it. He muttered something, it might have been a polite greeting or another oath, and dipped his head slightly, then tried to step around her. She sidestepped to stay in front of him. He moved back, and she followed. He began to look hunted. She decided to try putting him at ease before pressing the important question. She wanted answers, not more mumbling. You must be pleased to hear that the daughter heir is on her way to Camelin, Lord Pelavar. She'd heard several of the sitters mention that. His face went blank. Elaine Trakand has a right to put in her claim to the Lion Throne, he replied in a flat voice. Egwene's eyes widened, and he stepped back again, uncertainly. Perhaps he thought her angry over the absence of her title, but she barely noticed that. Pelavar had supported Elaine's mother in her claim for the throne, and Elaine had been sure he would support her too. She spoke of Pelavar fondly, like a favorite uncle. "Mother," Swan murmured at her elbow, "we must leave if you want to be sure of reaching the camp before sunset." She managed to put considerable urgency into those quiet words. The sun had passed its peak. "This is no weather to be in the open at nightfall," Pelavar said hurriedly. "If you will excuse me, I must make ready to leave." Shoving his cup onto the tray of a passing servant, he hesitated before halfway making a leg, and stalked off with the air of a man who had wriggled free of a trap. Egwene wanted to grind her teeth with frustration. What did the men think of their agreement? If it could be called that, the way she had forced it on them. Arathel and Aemlyn had more power and influence than most of the men, yet it was Pelavar and Kulhan and the like who rode with the soldiers. They could still make this flare up in her face like a barrel of lamp oil. "Find Shiriam," she growled, "and tell her to get everyone mounted now, no matter what it takes." She could not give the sitters a night to think about what had happened today, to plan and plan. They had to be back in camp before the sun went down. Chapter 19. The Law. Getting the sitters to their mounts proved no bother. They were as eager to be away as Egwene, especially Romanda and Lilane, both cold as the wind and with eyes like thunderclouds. The rest were the very image of cool-eyed Aes Sedai's serenity, giving off composure like a heavy scent, yet they glided to their horses so quickly that the nobles were left gaping, and the brightly clad servants scrambled in loading the pack horses to catch up as best they could. Egwene had Daishar set a hard pace in the snow, and with no more than a look and a nod from her, Lord Bryn made sure the armored escorts moved as fast. Swan on Bella and Shiriam on wing rushed to join her. For long stretches they churned through fetlock-deep cover, the horses stepping high at near to a trot, the flame of Tarvalon rippling in the icy breeze, and even when it was necessary to slow, when the horses were sinking knee-deep through the snow crust, they kept to a fast walk. The sitters had no choice except to keep up, and their speed cut down their opportunity to talk on the way. At that tiring pace, a lack of attention to your horse could bring a broken leg for the animal and a broken neck for you. Even so, Romanda and Lilane each managed to gather her coterie around her, and those two knots floundered through the snow, surrounded by wards against eavesdropping. The pair seemed to be delivering tirades. Egwene could imagine the topic. For that matter, other sitters managed to ride together for a time, exchanging a few words quietly and casting cool glances sometimes at her and sometimes at the sisters wrapped around by Saidar. Only Delana never joined one of those brief conversations. She stayed close beside Halima, who at last admitted that she was cold. Face tight, the countrywoman held her cloak close around her, but she still tried to comfort Delana, whispering to her almost constantly. Delana seemed to need comforting. Her brows were drawn down, putting a crease in her forehead that actually made her seem aged. She was not the only one worried. The others masked the feeling rigidly, radiating absolute poise, but the warders rode like men expecting the worst to leap out of the snow at the next step, eyes shifting in an unceasing watch, disquieting cloaks streaming in the wind to leave hands free. When an Aes Sedai worried, her warder worried, and the sitters were too absorbed to think of calming the men. Egwene was just as glad to see it. If the sitters were troubled, they had not yet made up their minds. When Bryn rode out to confer with Uno, she took the opportunity to ask what the two women had learned about Aes Sedai and tower guards in Andor. "Not much," Swan replied in a tight voice. Shaggy Bella did not seem to be having any difficulty with the pace, but Swan did, gripping her reins tightly in one hand and the pommel of her saddle with the other. "As near as I can make out, there are 50 rumors and no facts." It's a likely sort of tale to spring up, but it might still be true. Bella lurched, her front hooves sinking deep, and Swan gasped. The light burn all horses. Shiriam had learned no more. She shook her head and sighed irritably. It sounds all feathers and nonsense to me, Mother. There are always rumors of sisters sneaking about. Didn't you ever learn to ride, Swan? She added, her voice suddenly dripping derision. By tonight you'll be too sore to walk. Shiriam's nerves must have been ragged for her to burst out so openly. From the way she kept shifting in her saddle, she had already achieved her prediction for Swan. Swan's eyes hardened, her mouth already half smiling, never mind who was watching from behind the banner. Be still, both of you, Egwene snapped. She took a deep, calming breath. She was a bit ragged herself. Whatever Arathel believed, any force Elida sent to interfere with them would be too large for sneaking. That left the Black Tower, a disaster in the making. You got further plucking the chicken in front of you than trying to start on one up a tree, especially when the tree was in another country and there might not even be another chicken. Still, she bit off her words in giving Shiriam instructions for once they reached the camp. She was the Amerlin seat, and that meant all Aes Sedai were her responsibility, even those following Elida. Her voice was rock steady, though. It was too late to be frightened once you grabbed the wolf by the ears. Shiriam's tilted eyes went wide at the orders. Mother, if I may ask, why... She trailed off under Egwene's level gaze and swallowed. It will be as you say, Mother, she said slowly. Strange. I remember the day you and Nynaeve came to the tower. Two girls who couldn't decide whether to be excited or frightened. So much has changed since then. Everything. Nothing stays the same forever, Egwene told her. She gave Swan a significant look, but Swan refused to see. She appeared to be sulking. Shiriam looked sick. Lord Bryn returned then, and he must have sensed the mood among them. Aside from saying that they were making good time, he kept his mouth shut. A wise man. Making good time or not, the sun was sitting almost on the treetops when they finally rode through the army's sprawling camp. Wagons and tents cast long shadows across the snow, and a number of men were hard at work building yet more low shelters out of brush. There were not nearly enough tents, even for all the soldiers, and the camp held almost as many harness makers and laundresses and fletchers and the like, all those who inevitably followed any army. The ringing of anvils spoke of farriers and armorers and blacksmiths still at their labors. Cook fires were burning everywhere, and cavalry peeled away, eager for warmth and hot food, as soon as their wearily plodding animals were cared for. Surprisingly, Bryn rode on at Egwene's side after she dismissed him. If you will allow, Mother, he said. I thought I might accompany you a while longer. Shiriam actually twisted in her saddle to stare in astonishment. Swan stared too, straight ahead, as if not daring to turn her suddenly wide eyes toward him. What did he think he could do? Act as her bodyguard? Against sisters? That fellow with the drippy nose would do as well. Reveal just how completely he was on her side? Tomorrow was time enough for that if all went well tonight. That revelation now might easily stampede the hall in directions she hardly dared contemplate. Tonight is for Aes Sedai business, she told him firmly. But silly as the suggestion was, he had offered to put himself at risk for her. There was no telling his reasons. Who knew why a man would yet she owed him for that, among other things. Unless I send Swan to you tonight, Lord Bryn, you should leave before morning. If blame for today attaches itself to me, it might fall on you, too. Staying could prove dangerous, even fatal. I don't think they would need much excuse. No need to name who they were. I gave my word, he replied quietly, patting Traveler's neck. To Tarvalin. Pausing, he glanced toward Swan. It was less a hesitation than a consideration. Whatever tonight's business is, he said finally, remember that you have 30,000 men and Gareth Bryn behind you. That should count for something even among Aes Sedai. Until tomorrow, Mother. Reining his big-nosed bay around, he called over his shoulder, I expect to see you tomorrow too, Swan. Nothing changes that. Swan stared at his back as he rode away. There was anguish in her eyes. Egwene could not help staring too. He had never been so open before, not nearly. Why now, of all times? Crossing the 40 or 50 paces that separated the army's camp from the Aes Sedai's, she nodded to Shiriam, who drew rein at the first tents. She and Swan rode on. Behind them, Shiriam's voice rose, surprisingly clear and steady. The Amerlin seat calls the hall to sit this day in formal session. Let preparations be made with all speed. Egwene did not look back. At her tent, a bony groom, kicking her layered woolen skirts, came running to take Daishar and Bella. Her face was pinched, and she barely ducked her head before hurrying away with the horses as quickly as she had come. The warmth of the glowing braziers inside was like a fist closing down. Egwene had not realized how cold it was outside until then, or how cold she was.
I'll be right back.
Chesa took her cloak and exclaimed when she felt her hands. Why, you're iced to the bone, Mother. Chattering away, she bustled around, folding Egwene's cloak and Swan's, smoothing the neatly turned-down blankets on Egwene's cot, touching a tray set on one of the chests that had been pulled down.